Hi everybody, welcome back for week 9. We are covering this week, week 2, or part 2, rather, of second order cybernetics, picking up where we left off last week and emphasizing some of the aspects of second order cybernetics that pertain to your readings and that you will recognize having read the articles and book chapters assigned for this portion of the class. First, I'd like to go over and expand just a little bit on some of the concepts of second-order cybernetics that were covered specifically in the Bekvar and Bekvar text. The first of these is autopoiesis. This is a term that comes from Maturana and Varela. They are a couple of the cyberneticians and constructivists that I referred to previously in the trimester. And what this term essentially means is the process and patterns by which systems become recognized and defined, and also the means by which systems regulate themselves. The term consensual domains, which pertains to second-order cybernetics, essentially refers to the creation of a particular reality as a function of observation and interaction. Now, this harks back to what I spoke about in the lecture last week. Essentially, when we observe a system, we can't help but also simultaneously observe ourselves observing it. So everything is self-referential in this way. When we observe a system, we create the reality of that system. We create it because we're observing it through our own particular lens. And so we are making new meaning of this system because our observations necessarily include ourselves in the observing. Now, this can be a really sort of trippy thing. I advise you not to think too hard on some of these terms because essentially they boil down to some common points. And when it comes to consensual domains, the real common factor here, the real foundational element of this is that in observing the world, in observing systems, we are also observing ourselves. Everything that we perceive, everything that we identify, everything that we assess and we judge when we're observing systems in the world around us includes ourselves, because after all, they are our observations, they are our assessments, they are our perceptions, our judgments. And as a function of observing them and naming them in such a way, we are also observing ourselves and have to take responsibility for the reality that we are thus creating. The epistemology of participation that Bekvar and Bekvar talk about essentially has to do with this. Individuals and systems are constantly interacting and making adjustments in this reciprocal and recursive fashion. Now, you'll remember the terms reciprocal and recursive from when we talked about circular versus linear causality, right? Reality is a co-creation. It's a co-construction among the members of a system. And this includes, as we now know, talking about second-order cybernetics, whoever might be observing that system. So as I am making observations about systems, I'm creating a new reality about that system. And as I respond to that new reality, my understanding, my perception expands, which allows me to see new things in the reality of the system that I'm observing, which then influences my perspective even more. And on and on and on it goes in this reciprocal fashion. All knowledge is subjective. And in our attempts to understand reality, we are ultimately saying as much about ourselves as we are about whatever it is we are seeking to describe in our observations. Again, like I mentioned in the last slide, a lot of this comes down to very basic central points when it comes to second-order cybernetics, mainly that our attempts to understand reality say as much about us as they do about this reality out there that we are observing and attempting to understand. Again, here we come across the concept of feedback, which is essentially this idea that a system is always operating to maintain itself. Here's the second order element of the concept of feedback. As therapists, it is our ethical obligation, it's essential that we consider the ecological balance of the system as a whole, that we understand the system as a whole, rather than looking at isolated parts. When we do this, it helps us avoid trying to maximize or minimize certain parts of the system to the detriment of the whole system. Now, I'd like you, when thinking about the concept of feedback, to go back to the Atkinson and Heath article that you read this week with further thoughts on a second order therapy, and think about what Atkinson and Heath have to say about the ecology of human systems and the importance of us thinking always about the system as a whole and always acting with the ecological balance of that system in mind. The concept of non-purposeful drift essentially tells us that the structure of a system is determined by the interactions that take place within that system. Those interactions, those patterns, are what define a system, are what give that system its structure, its essence, its identity. When we work with families, we must realize that our objective is not to change the families, but to collaborate with members of the families to facilitate the creation of a new context that supports desired behaviors. So we're always working with this balance of stability and change in mind. We spoke about stability and change several weeks ago. The system needs to maintain its structure and its ultimate core identity. So the interactions within that family need to be considered, and the autonomy of that family needs to be considered when we work with the families in therapy. So we work with these families not with the mind of changing the families, but rather with collaborating, understanding our participation in the system, and working so that a new context can be established in which new behaviors can be facilitated and the maladaptive or unworkable or undesired patterns of interaction within that family no longer fit within the new context that we're co-creating with the families we work with. We're coming back again now to another concept that we'll recognize from first order cybernetics, which is that of openness and closedness of systems. Now we're again, of course, taking into consideration our participation in the system as an observer. So the system plus the observer, right, which is us as therapists, are understood to be mutually interacting within a larger system whose boundary is closed. So the system now becomes not just the family, let's say, but the family plus the therapist. And the process of therapeutic change, therefore, occurs as a function of perturbations that take place within this closed system. The process of therapeutic change occurs as a function of interactions between the members of the family and the therapist, participating in a closed system that's defined by particular sets of rules and particular kinds of interactions. Reality, as we've talked about now from the beginning of this class, is a multiverse. Each of us lives in and creates, constantly creates, a unique reality. And what's important is that we recognize that each person's reality is true and valid because it is grounded in their unique and particular context. Because of this, every person's reality must be acknowledged, respected, and balanced. Structural coupling is a term that refers to the degree to which systems can coexist with each other. It has to do essentially with the fitness or congruence between systems. Structural determinism refers to the limitedness of a system in terms of what it can or cannot do as a function of its particular structure. Families, for example, are organized in such a way that whatever they do is logical given their particular structure. What they do is only wrong from the perspective of an outsider who chooses to label what they do as wrong. This is that really challenging thing that we talked about last week. If we are looking at a family from that first order distanced observer position, it might be easy for us to identify and label what's wrong with the system. But when we do that, We're essentially operating from our own perceptions, our own convictions about what right or wrong actually is. A second order perspective, a second order approach to this involves the therapist getting curious and asking, how does this behavior or how do these interactions among members of this family make sense given the particular structure of the family and the particular context in which this family exists? So when we take into consideration the particular structure of the family, and we begin to consider how the family's interactions, how the behaviors of members of the family make sense, we have a lot more flexibility in addressing what's going on with the family. And we can approach this from a collaborative position, joining with our clients to try to create new contexts and try to establish healthier patterns of interaction that take into consideration, again, the ecological balance of that system, versus believing that we can take this objective stance as a therapist, identify what's wrong with the family, and come in from a one-up position, so to speak, to create changes in that family and move them toward some definition of health, which of course would be our definition of health. I hope this is making sense here. Again, remember, as you come up with questions while we're going through the lectures, take note of them so that you can post them on the discussion board. Now, as we move into more complex and complicated territory in this class, it's important that you feel that you're not getting stuck anywhere and that you have the opportunity to ask questions. And what we don't have available to us is the ability to do it live like we would in the classroom setting, but what we do have is the opportunity to discuss this with each other in the format available to us, which is the discussion board. So please, if you get stuck anywhere in the lecture with any of these terms or any of the concepts that I'm presenting or going over from your readings, make note of them and post them on the discussion board so we can all have a conversation about it and clarify any confusion. We come up now on the concept of wholeness and self-reference, which won't be new to you because of what we've covered so far in second-order cybernetics. Basically, whatever we see reflects or says as much about us as it does about the object of our observation or organization. We cannot get outside ourselves and our particular frames of reference. Basically, everything that I've just gone over comes down to this. We only have so much control over a system that we work with, whether it's therapy system, a work system, or the systems in which our families and our friends participate. A system is autonomous. It has its own structure and its own self-correcting mechanisms. We can influence systems, we can perturb systems, we can participate in systems, but we have to be careful about trying to control systems. And we have to recognize that because in even observing systems, let alone interacting with them, we are part of the system and not some outside objective observer, it's impossible to unilaterally control a system. The best we can do is play a role within the system to perturb and influence it. As you read in the Atkinson and Heath article this week, Gregory Bateson has a really unique and important message to say about the ecosystemic balance of systems. What he says is knowledge will never replace respect in man's dealings with ecosystems. What this basically means is we've got to be respectful of how nature takes care of itself and self-corrects. When we go in with an effort to control, based on what we might think we know about what's best, we run the very real risk of upsetting the balance of nature. And this could result in long-term negative consequences for the system. Instead, what he implores us to do is approach our work with respect and with understanding for systems as a whole. And understanding that whatever we do affects the system in particular kinds of ways. And if we're not mindful of the impact of our interventions, we could do real harm to the systems that we work with and that we participate in. Therapists must discover how to participate in systems in a way that promotes systemic self-correction rather than attempting to engineer conscious control over the system. Here are a couple of examples that I think will ground this in the therapeutic context and I hope help you to make a little bit more sense of what Bateson is talking about and what we mean when we talk about respect for ecosystemic balance versus efforts for conscious control. If a therapist in therapy is too passive, he or she may not adequately address problems in extreme cases like anorexia, intimate partner violence, or self-harm. So in other words, a therapist who thinks, I want to be so respectful of this system and how it operates, and I don't want to perturb the system too much, and I want to consider the context of this system and how this behavior makes sense. A therapist who thinks that way but takes a really passive, withdrawn role runs a particular kind of risk. And here's what it is, or here's an example of how it would work rather. Let's say a consultant is hired by a nonprofit organization to help with low staff morale. The executive director in this organization has a drinking problem, and the consultant rather, in his or her efforts to avoid addressing this and the connection it may have to low staff morale, may actually serve to make the problem worse. In his or her passivity, avoiding the issue at hand, choosing not to talk about the issue at hand, serves to maintain the problem, right? Serves to keep from any real helpful change taking place within that system. And so that passivity, that unwillingness to take an active role, has a particular kind of effect in that organizational system. Namely, no change happens, and, in fact, the potential for it to get worse has just been facilitated. But then the opposite can also happen. At times, a therapist may be too directive, may be too advice-giving, may try too hard to effect change within the system. And here's an example of what that would look like. Let's say Sandy went to a therapist for problems with her husband. And the therapist encouraged Sandy to ask her husband to move out. By doing this, the therapist told Sandy that her husband would realize how serious she was in her desire to get him to change, right? So the therapist says, look, you're obviously having problems with your husband. Why don't you pack up your stuff and move out? And maybe then he'll really get the message. He'll see how serious you are about wanting him to change. So Sandy's husband, believing that her therapist is the expert, listened to the therapist's advice, packed her stuff, and did move out. But he never moved back in. In fact, he met another woman, he married her, and he became very involved with this woman's 2 children. So now Sandy, for having gone to a therapist who overestimated her ability to create change in this family by being guided, by what she believes to be best for this system, created the following situation. Sandy's got no husband. She's got a lot less money to live on than she had before. And now she's got the responsibility of parenting her children almost by herself. This therapist did not consider the consequences of her directive intervention. Rather than considering the larger systemic implications of her intervention, she looked only at trying to maximize one part of the system, the wife. So hopefully this helps to make sense of that idea of ecosystemic balance that Bateson was talking about, and respect for the system as a whole that Bateson was talking about. To do this involves a great deal of consideration for the implications of our actions, and a very, very cautious approach to what we say to our clients and what we attempt to do with our clients in our work with them. An understanding of second-order cybernetics helps us clearly recognize what it means to think systemically. Taking the systemic view in therapy requires us to think through all the possible results of our observations and interventions. We take into consideration the entire system and recognize that what we believe influences what we see, and this influences how we act, which influences the system within which we are interacting. This ripple effect can have a major impact on the whole family system. So we have to keep it in mind from step one. We have to keep this in mind from the moment we meet our clients. Thinking systemically is far more than just understanding what systems are. Thinking systemically and being systemic therapists, consultants, coaches means understanding that our beliefs, our perspectives, our worldview is always informing what we observe, what we notice, and because of that, it's always informing what we do with the people we work with. And what we do with the people we work with has an impact on their lives. And that impact spreads to the systems that they are a part of, that the people we work with are a part of, spreads to the systems that they participate in. And it has broad implications. So our interventions have broad impacts. And we need to always be mindful of that, to make sure that we first do no harm, as I spoke about last week, to our clients. And that we always work with respect for the ecological balance of the systems that we're participating in. Before we conclude for this week, and I should have mentioned at the start of the lecture that it would be a brief one, I want to juxtapose here first-order cybernetics and second-order cybernetics. In first-order cybernetics, as I mentioned last week, the observer is considered outside of the system he or she is observing. And in second-order cybernetics, the observer is part of the observed. Now, guys, this is just a conceptual difference between the two, because the reality is when we are observing systems, we're always part of what we're observing. We can't get away from that. So a first-order cybernetician fails to or chooses not to recognize this self-reference. A second-order cybernetician, a second-order therapist, always recognizes that he or she is part of what's being observed. First-order cybernetics operates from a perspective of objectivity, whereas second-order cybernetics includes a recognition of the subjectivity and self-reference of observations. In a first-order cybernetics perspective, the therapist's reality is the truth. What the therapist believes to be true or right is the truth with a capital T. A second-order cybernetician or therapist works with respect for multiple perspectives, recognizing the validity and relative truth of each perspective in the room, including his or her own, recognizing that his or her reality does not trump the reality of anybody else's in the room. A first-order cybernetician has ideas about how clients should be. A second-order cybernetician, I'm getting all tripped up here, forgive me, please. A second-order cybernetician or therapist believes that there are many ways that clients can be. And so he or she operates with curiosity and respect. First-order cybernetics is more technique-driven, so first-order therapy is more driven by technique, whereas second-order therapy is less technique-oriented, because it's taking into consideration the unique and significant reality of the system, of the client. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, one technique works for all approach. First-order cyberneticians or therapists create interventions, attempting to make particular kinds of changes, A second order cybernetician or therapist works to create space for change, collaborating with clients to do this. First order therapists engage in less self-reflection than second order therapists, because second order therapists are always aware of the self-reference of their observations and reflections. First order therapists work with pragmatic strategies. Second order therapists work with aesthetic wisdom. It can be said that first order therapists do therapy, whereas second order therapists work as therapists. They work on being a therapist, embodying themselves as the instrument for the work that they do. It's not like a doctor performing medicine. It's not like a surgeon doing surgery. We are an embodiment of the work that we do. So we work on being the most mindful, self-aware, respectful therapists that we can be. A first order therapist takes a knowing position, whereas a second order therapist takes a not knowing position. Now that doesn't mean that we don't have certain expertise and that we know nothing. What it means is that we take a curious position. We ask questions. We don't see ourselves as the expert. While we may be the expert in some things, some book knowledge, certain aspects of human behavior and human relationships, we can never be the experts in our clients' unique realities. And so we always seek to know more about our clients' unique realities. And we're always cautious with what we perceive, what we say, and what we do with the people we work with. So that's it for this week, folks. I encourage you very highly to go back over all of the readings, not only from this week, but from last week as well, and to work as hard as you can to get an understanding of what it means to be a second order therapist. This stuff only makes sense if we ground it in the context in which you're going to apply it, and that's ultimately in your work as a therapist or as a coach. And again, I encourage and invite you to take note of any confusion or curiosity that remains as you're going through these readings and hearing these lectures, and put them up on the discussion board so we can continue to have a conversation and expand your ideas about how you can step into this role as a second order therapist, really embodying the systemic nature of your work. The concepts for this week, which you can utilize in future short papers as well as your final film review paper, are of course any of the second order cybernetics concepts that appeared in Bekvar and Bekvar and I reviewed at the top of the lecture. The concept of ecosystemic balance as posed by Bateson and covered in the Atkinson article as well as our lecture this week. And of course the concept of self-reference, which I now have spoken about 2 weeks running. I hope that you enjoyed the lecture this week. I hope that you are clear about the distinction between first and second order cybernetics, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in Blackboard. Take care and have a wonderful week.